My name is Gayathri Shylesh. Today's presentation is about the seasonal regimens. I just wanted to start with an invocation. Gajananam bhutaganadi sevitam kapitta jambhu falasara bhakshitam Uma sutam shokadinashagaranam namami vigneshwara pada pangajam. In Ayurveda, the concept of time and seasons and life cycles are a very critical concept. And so Shruti very wonderfully alluded to the ability of an individual to be aware of the macrocosm as well as the effect of the macrocosm on the microcosm, which is really us as human beings and our organism. And this is what we will cover. So the agenda that we'll cover today are just an intro to basics of time and seasons and the quality of seasons and how we describe seasons in Ayurveda. So to start with, the concept of time in Ayurveda and all Vedic sciences is a very important one. While we strive to transcend the spatio-temporal realm, time is still the reality in which we progress. So we know that the Earth's axis is an imaginary line that connects the North to the South Pole. And that line is, if you look at the Earth is actually tilted at 23.5 degrees from the vertical on the orbital plane of the Earth. And we all know that the Earth rotates on its axis in 24 hours and then revolved around the sun in 365 days. So if you were to look from the top, the Earth is actually going counterclockwise, if you will, if there is such a way to look at the top. Yeah, the Earth revolves, the exposure of the sun in different parts of either the northern or the southern hemisphere varies. So as we come into the March time frame, you'll notice that the sun's rays start to be exposed, starts to increase in the northern hemisphere while it starts to decrease. And then at the time of the equinox, on both ends, really, the sun's rays are falling exactly at 90 degrees at the equator. And that means that time is sort of divided into equal portions of 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. Well, that kind of changes depending also on the latitude that you live in. So I live up in the Seattle area, and it's really interesting to see when the sun sets at 4 p.m. and it never gets light again till 7:30 or 8 in the morning. But people in the southern hemisphere or in the other corners of the earth may experience it totally different. Then we all know at the poles, there's usually months of constant sunlight or months of constant darkness. So the idea being here, the seasons arise from these transitions and these junctions of transition as the earth revolves around the sun. And at the junctures of how the earth revolves, there are changes that come about in nature. And so we also see weather and climatic fluctuations that occur. And again, it also varies depending on where you live. So if you're living near a desert versus if you're living near the sea, or if you're living higher up in the northern latitudes versus the southern latitudes, you're going to see very big fluctuations in seasons and conditions. And okay, so I'd like to maybe just talk about the quality of seasons. So in Ayurveda, we use the term to denote nature, and I'm sure many of you have studied the philosophy of Ayurveda, the Sankhya philosophy that refers to Prakriti and Purusha and so on. So if you look at the macrocosm, the Prakriti of nature, you can see the constant ceaseless interaction of seasons, so cyclical rhythms, right? It's constant, it's always changing. Of course, with us as humans contributing to, uh, the environmental changes, and of course, that's a very debatable topic, I understand. We can see the changes that occur. So, for the first time, I've seen extremely warm temperatures in January in Seattle when it should be much cooler. But having said that, you also start to notice with the change in seasons how the five elements change or the Panchamahabhutas change from an Ayurvedic perspective, if you will. You can also notice these patterns in nature through the leaves falling. I don't know if some of you have seen the time lapse videos of how trees shed their leaves and then they kind of wither and they look like they're dead and then they kind of spring back into life as the seasons change and so on. In the same way, just as nature goes through that regeneration, growth, expansion, contraction, and death or dormancy process, we also see that in the human life cycle, right? So, what's in the macrocosm also applies in the microcosm. And so, the same five elemental changes also occur in the human body, which is also, and so we're impacted by the seasonal changes as well. And many of us see this, like in Seattle, for example, seasonal affective disorder is very, very common as it is in Alaska because we have such short amounts of sunlight. Although you wouldn't say that for the month of January, we've had more bright blue skies and sunny skies and warm weather than any other time that I recall. But, people in Seattle drink a lot of coffee just to try to stay awake and stay stimulated because we lack from sunlight and vitamin D levels are very down as well. So because of the increased melatonin released by the pineal gland, there's also sort of this lethargy that sets in, decreased energy levels, and a tendency to stay isolated and kind of hibernate inside. And that's just normal human nature. We tend to sort of go with what's happening seasonally. And then what also happens is in order for us to kind of get that break in the mornings to get the oomph going, we down several cups of coffee. So Seattle's very famous for coffee. As many of you know, Starbucks is based out of here, although no real Seattleite would ever drink Starbucks coffee, of course. But, the same is true also in reverse seasonal affective disorder. In the summer, people, especially where in Seattle, for example, the sun doesn't set till 10 p.m. on some of the days. So we have these long periods of sunlight and people want to do a lot of outdoor activities. And so there's this hyperactivity that sets in. But that also means that you're disregarding the cycles of our organism. And so that kind of creates some issues as well, such as insomnia and irritability. So in Ayurveda, the term ritu is actually refers to seasons, or it actually means to go, or a flow, if you will. The term ritu, interestingly, is also used to refer to the menstruation cycle in women, although in this context, that's not what we are referring to. And then charya means to follow. So essentially, Ritucharya means to go in the direction of what flows with nature. And we know that Ayurveda as a holistic science emphasizes on homeostasis, literally keeping your health and equilibrium and balance to be in harmony with nature. So if we continue to look at the seasons, the concept of time, and again, I want to emphasize, I don't want to digress from this conversation by getting into the semantics of time because in Ayurveda, literally, you can break time down to the very minute, to a muhurta, which is an auspicious time, the break in the days where you can do specific things or actions that are very optimal for your organism. But that's another discussion. So if you look at it, look at the year, the 365 days. It's divided into two ayanas or a solstice, if you will, because we look at the solstice as sort of the juncture when the seasons start to change in different ways. Or kala is another term that we use to denote time. And we refer to the term Uttarayana or the northern solstice or Adana Kala. And Adan means, or Uttara means to remove or take away, which literally means the sun is taking away the rays. And Dakshinayana, or in the southern solstice, or Visarga Kala, means to give. And this little diagram, and I've just borrowed this from Dr. Celia's presentation from last year because I was trying to put mine together last night in a frenzy. So I did a lot of borrowing. So just to show you the movement, as the sun kind of travels in the northward direction, you start to get into the late winter and then transition to the seasons of the spring and summer. And then as the sun takes away the strength of people because you're not stimulated, you don't have the endorphins going or the body's not reacting enough to the availability of the sun, there comes in a weakness that gradually sets in. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the bala. And then as you transition into the sun transitions into the southward direction, the rains come, and it depends again. I realize that the weather changes depending on where you're living. This may not be the case in Arizona or in the desert, for example. You start to gain strength again in this period as the sun continues to give us more of its rays. So there's a cycle that's present always. And then getting into the types of seasons. So each ayana or the kala has 3 seasons each, for a total of 6 seasons. And of course, this is from the perspective of what is observed on the Indian subcontinent. Again, this may not exactly be so demarcated in the areas where some of you live or in other countries, for example. So in Uttarayana, the sun rays are removed, and so we have 3 seasons there. Roughly each season has 2 months allocated to it. And it's not like the beginning of the month or the end of the month. It's kind of, it sort of varies. So Shishira, or the winter season, roughly runs from January to February. Vasanta season, or spring, runs from March through April. Grishma, or summer, runs from May through June. And then as the sun starts to move in the southward direction, in the Dakshina of the Sargakala, where you start to get more of the sun's rays, you then have the 3 other seasons. So the Varsha, or the monsoon seasons, or the rainy season, runs roughly from July to August. Sharata is autumn or early fall, and that runs from September to October. And then Himanta, or the late autumn or early winter, runs between November and December. And I found this chart on allayurveda.com, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And once you start to learn pulse diagnosis, you'll be able to see how the pulse varies in an individual. It's an interesting sort of experiment for you to even start to see this on yourself by simply checking your pulse at the juncture of seasons to see how your pulse varies. So, addressing bala in seasons, or the effect of strength of the sun's rays on the body. So at the beginning of the Visarga Kala and the end of the Adana Kala, that is in the Varsha and the Grishma season, as I showed you in the earlier slide, there is a weakness that occurs. And in the middle of the solstice, during the Sharata and the Vasanta season, the strength maintains and continues to be moderate. And at the end of the Visarga Kala and then in the beginning of Adana Kala, that during the Hemanta and Shishira season, maximum strength is seen. So this little chart, and again, this is from one of the research that I saw in the Asian Medical Ayurvedic, and this is in my reference, by the way. I can't exactly remember the name, but this sort of shows you how the bala, or the strength, varies in the different seasons. And again, the month here refer to the lunar cycle month. So for in the southern part of India, where people tend to follow a southern calendar, we look at how the sun comes into different constellations and how the sun exerts its influence in each of those areas of the constellations and how it has an effect on your own body. And I realize I'm introducing a lot of new concepts. So please feel free to ask any questions. I will attempt to answer it. I'm certainly no expert. So of course, as you can see, with the sun's rays, the effect on our Agni, or our digestive fire, clearly is impactful. I'd be curious to see, or maybe even know, whether the symptoms vary with the seasons. Because in the colder seasons, you may tend to eat more spicier foods, more hot foods in an attempt to stay warm. Whereas it's contraindicated in the summer when you shouldn't be eating spicy stuff. Instead, you should be eating more cool stuff. So this has a correlation on your Agni as well. So again, at the beginning of the end of the periods, Agni will be weak. During the middle of the Adana Kala, in the middle of the Visarga Kala, Agni will continue to stay moderate and medium. And again, during the end and beginning, respectively, Agni will be best. And the terms here used in the Agni column are Tikshna Agni, which is sharp, Madhyama Agni, which is medium or moderate, and Mandagni, which is slow or slowed down Agni. All right. Moving on. We also take into consideration the effect on the rasas, of the 6 tastes, because our taste change. We start to crave different things. And many of you have noticed in the winter month, we want richer foods. The holidays come in, comfort and nurturing are sort of implied with the richer foods, with the creamier foods that we want to eat, and more sweets and so on. So during the Dakshinayana time, which is of our Sharad and Hemanta seasons, we say that the moon is predominant. And so the taste of Amla, which is sour, Lavana, which is salty, and Madhura, which is sweet, are more powerful. And we'll start to crave these a little bit more. Whereas in contrast, during the Uttarayana part of the year, which is the other three seasons, the sun is more predominant. And so with that, you have a little bit more of the heating taste, which is a Pitta, which is bitter, Kashaya, which is astringent, and the Katu taste, which is pungent, are more powerful. Again, this chart kind of shows you that. And with each of our tastes, you can see the quality of that taste contributes to or diminishes the strength of the individual. So the foods that you eat actually sort of either contribute to the nourishment or the depletion of your body. And you can see how it affects your mind and your spirit in turn. Speaking on the influence on the doshas and your health, so changes in the Panchamahabhutas or the five elements clearly imply changes in the doshas. We all know what Vata is and what Pitta is and Kapha is. And if you don't, please get very familiar with this. Because the qualities of each of those doshas kind of are highlighted with the change in seasons. So because Vata tends to have the quality of cold and dryness, cold and dry weather aggravates or increases Vata. Similarly, Pitta is very hot and moist and oily, so the hot and humid climates tend to aggravate Pitta. And then again, Kapha, which tends to be very heavy and cold and all of those qualities, the cold and wet weather tends to aggravate Kapha. So we can see this, the early signs as the seasons change. You can see in the winter, our skin starts to dry up. We're putting on more moisturizer, more body lotion, and so on. And that's an indication of which of your doshas are starting to go out of balance. And then, of course, in the summer, I mean, as the sun increases, there are people who like to sit out and get a lot of sun rays, but we also see people who get heated up, their faces start to turn red, the allergies start to come in depending on which part of the country you live in. And then as the season starts to transition again in the early fall or autumn is when people start to get breakouts, the liver is starting to adjust again and so on. And interestingly, in both traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, we notice that many chronic illnesses actually begin or raise its head at the junction of change in seasons. And I used to notice that about myself, and I knew that there was something to it. I just never could find anybody to explain it to me. There's a question here of when there's this unseasonable weather all of a sudden, like a heat wave, is that also a time when illnesses can begin? Well, it's possible because our environment certainly has an impact, right, on us. But that may be, as our climate continues to change, as we continue to experience weather changes, our physiology also is changing to correlate with that. So it's entirely possible. But and you may experience acute symptoms of something. So your skin might break out, or you might have hyperacidity, or you might just feel exhausted. So it just sort of depends, like a heat wave where the sun's energies are extremely intense. Your pitta can be aggravated, and you could certainly see pitta aggravation symptoms. Other influences on dosha. So the agenda that we'll cover today are just an intro to basics of time and seasons and the quality of seasons and how we describe seasons in Ayurveda. And then also the effect and strength, which is referred to as bala, on Agni and Rasa. Agni, as you know, is the digestive fire, and Rasa are the tastes, which there are six tastes. And then I'll also attempt to present the influence of the change in seasons on our doshas and our health, and then present why should we follow a seasonal regimen, and then also the actual regimen protocols to be followed in each season. And then I'll just summarize quickly and provide some references. I just wanted to start with an invocation. Om Gajananam Bhutaganaadisevitam Kapittajambhufalasaravhakshitam Umasutam Shokadinashakaranam Namami Vigneshwara Pangajam. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshuranmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Um, excuse me, pardon the frog in my throat here. My name is Gayathri Shylesh. Some of you heard me from last week's presentation. So again, getting into a little bit more detail into Pitta, as I've already stated. So Pitta, again, the qualities of Pitta are hot, oily, moist, very intense, just like summer. So that late spring, summertime, and late summertime is very aggravating to Pitta. So again, you can look at the different people around you and even at yourself, even members of your family, how different individuals start to experience changes in their body and their mind body, if you will, as the seasons change. Vata people, again, the quality of Vata is light, cold, mobile, and dry. And so you'll start to see similar attributes present itself during the Vata time of the year. And so they'll start to see similar symptoms in their own physiology: dry skin, dry mouth, the hair starts to feel brittle, etc. And then again in Kapha, Kapha is again moist, heavy and stable. And so in the late fall or the early winter months and the winter months, that's when they need to be very careful, because that's also the time when we indulge in a lot of sweets and rich and heavy foods. And that's also when they will start to experience a lot of congestion. And for some of us who are not just very demarcated pittas, vatas, or kappas, we may be a combination of the doshas. We'll start to see the kapha in us perhaps be more aggravated. So I know many people, and I've noticed as I've gotten older, the kapha sometimes, for me in the late winter time, starts to stagnate even more. So I have to do my daily routines of always flushing my nasal passages and not having any mucus producing foods and things like that in the winter time, like milk and soy and fermented foods and those kind of things. So why Ritucharya? In the Charaka Samhita, which is one of the ancient texts in the Sutrasthana in chapter 6, is almost entirely dedicated to the quality of dietetics based on seasonal changes, right? So there's a verse there that says, Tatya Shitadiya Ahar Balam Varnasya Vardhate, Tasyartu Satat Satmayam Baditam Cheshta Harvya Pasrayam. I'm sorry, I do better reading Sanskrit than I do the English transliteration here. um, so what the verse really means is the strength and complexion of the person, knowing the suitable diet and regimen for every season and practicing them accordingly are enhanced. So it's just natural wisdom for us to follow the cycles, the life cycles and the natural cycles, and follow the appropriate diet and lifestyle regimens for that season. So Ayurveda prescribes the seasonal routine to help us keep that homeostasis without imbalancing our doshas too much. And so why do it, right? So the body goes through a certain amount of stress and strain as the seasonal changes occur. So, for me, for example, I notice that as soon as the temperature starts to drop in September, October, I immediately start to shiver. And I just like, I hate that feeling because I start to feel it in my joints and all of that. So what do? You have to put on layers of clothes. You have to make sure that you can take off layers in case it starts to get warm again, right? And this is a way to not only prevent disease and sort of infection to keep your immune system strong, but it also kind of maintains vitality of your organism at a minimum, and if not, increase your vitality. So each season requires that a unique diet or ahara and a distinct mode of living, which is vihara, and a routine living is in place. And many of us are very privileged to live in areas where things grow naturally. So the most common sense you can do is just eat locally. Whatever grows in your area, try to eat that. And that usually helps your body adapt. So Shishira, or in the winter time, which is your environment again. And I'm just going through how the environment changes and the food and the lifestyle regimen to follow. So somewhere between mid-January to mid-March, we know that the cold starts to come in. The cold winds are blowing in again. Depending on where you live, you could be experiencing a lot of rain, like I do in here in Seattle, or very, very dry, perhaps like in Arizona. the sun is weak and the moon rays become more stronger, and so people start to keep and gain weight. They want to eat more to stay warm, and because we're always staying cold, our appetite increases as a way. The body in its attempt to keep homeostasis starts to raise the Jatara Agni, and so we want to eat more. The foods that we eat, we tend to eat more warming, heating, and stabilizing foods. We need to be eating more warm cereals, and I hope people don't eat cold cereals in the wintertime. If at all, anything like oatmeal or cooked quinoa, anything that's cooked together, excuse me, are very warming and nourishing for you. And avoid foods that are pungent, bitter, and astringent because these are all drying foods, and so these also create the quality of lightness and dryness within you. So you want to avoid this. And by all means, the suggestion is never eat salads during the winter, right? We don't eat raw foods typically in the regimen of Ayurveda, but especially in the cooler seasons. And I see sometimes people having salads in the winter, and I'm thinking, how do you digest that, right? Or like cold salad dressings and things like that. Vihara, which is your lifestyle regimen, again, this is an optimal time for you to have a massage with oil, have warm baths, and try to get sun. People here buy a lot of those SAD lights, which are lights that are very bright. You sit in front of it for 10 to 15 minutes. It sort of simulates sunlight. And so people's moods are enhanced as a result. Of course, common sense says that we wear warm clothes to keep the body heat in. We want to do exercises that are warming, and then you also limit outdoor activities, although skiing and snow sports are very, very big in the Pacific Northwest here. In Vasanta season, or the spring season, again, I realize that all parts of the country don't have very demarcated seasons. This is just going with the six seasons as described in Ayurveda. This season ranges from mid-March to mid-May. The sun starts to get more powerful as the sun rises, through its arc, if you will. The days start to feel warmer, and the kapha that has been accumulating through the winter starts to liquefy. We can see this in trees and flowers. They start to bloom. The leaves start to bud, and we can see lots of pollen sometimes floating around. Um, and for us here, the cherry blossom trees and the maple trees start to bloom. Very, very beautiful time of year. All the daffodils and irises coming out. Again, kapha starts to spread from being congested and collected and starts to spread through the body. So we'll start to notice the runny noses, the sneezing, the bronchitis, the sinusitis, etc. So good time to sort of get rid of the kapha, right? And I'll speak about the later slide. So your ahara or your diet, you want to start to increase your agni. So you want to start eating those bitter, pungent, astringent foods and start to use more spices uh, that pacify kapha. And avoid the harder foods, avoiding the colder, heavier foods of sweets that you've been eating over the holidays, etc. And then your lifestyle regimens, while you don't want to take hot water baths, you want to bathe in warm water. You want to do a dry massage than oil because the oil, which is similar to the kapha quality, aggravates kapha. So the dry massage, even with just a dry loofah, produces heat by friction. So it actually helps pacify kapha. Again, this does not trump your doshic predominance. So you have to pay attention to what dosha you're in. And again, sleeping during the day is always contraindicated in Ayurveda, but especially in this season because your digestion slows down, increasing ama or the toxicity. And again, vigorous exercise is always helpful to help clear that stagnated and increased kapha. And then as we move on into the summer, that usually ranges anywhere from mid-May to mid-July. The environment is intense with the sun's rays. There's usually a hot wind blowing. Sometimes the grounds are dry. The plants may just be still or withered. It may need to be watered. So the dehydration sets in. So Now, a vata starts to increase and the kapha starts to decrease, right? So there's an excessive drying that comes about that contributes to an increase in vata. So your diet or ahara, because your agni is sort of in a mild to weak state, you want to again choose foods that are light. So we know this, right? In the summer, we eat light foods, we eat cooling foods. We want to eat sweeter foods that are pitta pacifying and so on. So we tend to eat watermelons, more fruits and vegetables that have more water, the zucchinis, the squashes, etc. as well. Drink lots of water, coconut water, yogurt, lassi, fruit juices, etc. And we want to avoid the excess spices, the oily, pungent, sour, and warming foods. And I know a lot of people drink a lot of beer in the summer. It's not advisable, and it is contraindicated in Ayurveda, of course, as is caffeine, which is a stimulant. Your lifestyle practice should include trying to stay cool. Whereas in Seattle, when summer comes out, everybody's trying to get the sun's rays because it's not as intense here, So we try to get as much sun as possible. Whereas in the southern latitudes, maybe not so much, right? You don't want to get fried out in the sun. You want to take cooler baths. You want to use rose water as a pitta pacifying thing. You want to wear the lighter clothing, lighter colored clothing. You want to get more exposure to the moon. You want to avoid the dry, hot winds. Take light walks in the evening time rather than in midday. And don't overexercise clearly because you're again aggravating your pitta and you're increasing dehydration. Now, Varsha Ritu or the monsoon or rainy season, this is more prevalent very much. I mean, this is like on clockwork almost in India. So come end of May through July through mid-September, again, with all the climate changes, we've started to notice this has changed too. The rain clouds move in, there's thunder clouds, and I know in Texas and Louisiana this is also very common. There's a sudden influx of rain, it's like sudden heavy rains, and the rivers fill up. And so immediately there's this like increase in coldness, which increases vata. And I know like elder people, yeah, in Arizona too. Um, and so what I've noticed is in elders, especially people who are in their middle age or approaching 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., they start to get joint pains and arthritic pains increase, rheumatic pains increase during this time. So diets that favor it, of course, are sweet and grounding foods. Warming foods, not heating so much, but you want to stay warm to help continue to stimulate the digestion and elimination. We want to avoid the heavier foods that are harder to digest. And again, as part of your lifestyle practice, you should be doing some Abhyanga or oil massage. And again, avoid sleeping during the day, excessive exercise, or too much work as well, hard work. In the fall, again, we notice how the leaves change in the seasons. Again, our environment, the sun starts to become lighter, partly cloudy skies, and we start to notice this in ourselves. Vata becomes pacified, and the dry atmosphere starts to aggravate the pitta again. So again, at this juncture of the seasonal changes, pitta conditions can get aggravated. So we start to see this as eczema or skin rashes and so on. And again, our diet, uh, because of the activity of the Agni, you want to be able to eat foods that actually pacify pitta. And I'm not sure, I'm sorry, I just realized that there's wheat and honey. Wheat is actually pitta aggravating. So I would tend to favor not so much wheat, but more rice and things like that. And again, avoid hot, heavy, and oily and fermented sour foods that aggravate pitta. And try to be very mindful of when you are becoming hungry. So we tend to eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's no, we don't tend to pay attention to when we're hungry or start noticing when your hunger starts to change, right? Because even that changes. And as part of your lifestyle regimen, always recommended to bathe in the rays of the moon, to wear pearls, to pearl is considered a cooling gem, and wearing it against your body. And again, not for everybody. This is just a general guideline because sometimes pearls can be contraindicated for people depending on what's going on in your astrological chart. That's another topic. I've listed Rakta Moksha. Again, this is top. I've borrowed this from Dr. Celia's slide. This is clearly not practiced in the U.S. It is practiced in traditional Chinese medicine and in Ayurveda when excess pitta accumulates. Again, try to avoid day sleep. We want to avoid accumulation of ama and so on. And then as we step into late fall and early winter, we start to notice that the coolness starts to increase. It starts to feel cold outside. We start to feel a little bit stronger. The pitta is pacified, right? And our agni increases. So we want to start eating more foods, more stews and soups and more salty things and so on. Um, at this juncture, we want to avoid vata aggravating foods. Again, the dry foods like the raw foods and salads and popcorns and dry cereals and all of those things. And cold drinks, especially. This is a time when you want to be drinking warm soups and teas and broths and milk and so on. Um, with your lifestyle practice, again, you should be doing oil massages, warm baths and showers. Start to layer your clothes, start to sit near warm fires, or because our environment, unfortunately, we live in a very artificially controlled environment. I realize this is not always possible, but it's always nice because we actually shock our body sitting in air conditioning and heated environments. And so we tend to overreact or underreact to our environment because of that. So it's always nice to pay attention to these things. Again, awareness is key, and you can always start with yourself. So finally, let me make sure I covered all of that. Okay, so finally, there's a concept of Ritu Sandhi. So Sandhi is the junction or coming together of seasons. It's the junction or the place between the seasons when things start to change from one season to the next. So why is this important, right? So because the microcosm, the human physiology as an organism continues to change with the seasons, right? It's just like if you wanted to think about it, at a microcosm, our cells are going through cell birth and cell death, apoptosis, every minute, like there are hundreds and thousands of cells dying and regenerating. The same way as we start to look at the macrocosm, we're going through a regeneration and death process in almost every moment. And so part of our awareness should be, well, when does this happen, right? And as seasons transition, we know that our digestion changes. We know that our doshas are fluctuating, and it also affects our agni. And this is the time when we have to be aware of how our body is adapting to seasons. And our immunity is also affected. So we know the flu season, right? That's all you hear. We've now described our seasons in terms of diseases, which I find very interesting. Um, our resistance to disease also fluctuates. So these gaps in seasons, particularly between the winter and spring, is a natural opportunity to start doing some detox or cleansing, right? And you start to shift your diet, or skip the heavier foods and start adopting the easier to digest foods. We typically use 14 to 15 days in length. And what I mean by that is the period of the last 7 days of the current season that you're in and the 7 days of the next season that you're in. So you can use an ephemeris. An ephemeris is just a sort of a seasonal, a farmer's almanac, if you will. It's the best kind of comparable thing I can think about. I tend to look at one because I tend to do a lot of astrology. So I look at the breakdown of time from month to month, but a day-to-day basis and so on. But try to get into the habit of following how the seasons shift. And you have the groundhog. I recently saw something. I mean, I've been aware of it. How in Philadelphia or on the East Coast, people use the groundhog to determine how many more weeks of winter you have. So there's some wisdom there if we're observing the groundhog in nature to determine how many more weeks of winter we have. So why not follow it for ourselves using our own innate intelligence, right? And the idea of Ritu Sandhi is to start to gradually discontinue the foods and the regimens that you've been following the present season and then start gradually adopting the regimens and diet of the next season. The key word here being gradually, because if you do it abruptly, Ayurveda indicates that it leads to disease, and this term is asatya due to the non-habituation. You can't go from, if you've always been drinking hot teas to now doing cold ice water every day. That shocks the digestive system. The same way with our foods, try to go in a gradual fashion into that transition and try to complete your transition by day 15. Um, and then in summary, the key thing here is be dosha wise, right? I've just provided you some guidelines, but really be in tune with what your dosha is, what is predominant in your organism and your physiology, right? And with the fluctuations in seasons, notice for yourself, well, what comes up and what goes down. Look at your family members, look at your children, see what comes up and what goes down. Great way to observe and kind of start to develop awareness. So, our external environment influences our internal environment, right? That's a given. Observe and follow the natural rhythms and cycles and interactions and relationships in nature so we can follow the same thing or start to observe the same thing within us. Try to follow the appropriate seasonal regimen by adapting to the external environment in a smooth and seamless way. Eat locally and seasonally, the best piece of advice that is out there. Um, Follow your body's rhythms and notice a change in cycles. So, another thing to observe is we can look at, like, people living in California may have access to more fruits and vegetables of a certain season throughout the year, whereas that may not always be available in the northern latitudes or in Arizona or in New York. So, just look to see. Visiting a farmer's market, if you're ever blessed to have one, which we are, we have hundreds and hundreds of farmers markets here in the Pacific Northwest. It's always lovely to see what is in season and then follow your common sense and follow that. Follow a gradual process of adaptation just as nature does. And that's all I have, and here are my references. I really used a lot of the material from the Asian Journal of Modern and Ayurvedic Medical Sciences, Maharishi Ayurveda by Mishra, Dr. J.V. Habar's references, and then, of course, Dr. Celia's presentation from last year, and then also the Charaka Samhita. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will inculcate these practices for yourself. Namaste.